right now there is a war on farming. People don't actually realize it, but they are on the verge of destroying farming within Canada and, in fact, across the Western world. So the question is, are net zero targets of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide misguided? You saw part of that already. I'm going to give a bit more. And here's the new thing I'm going to give you is what will it cost farmers and how do we get out of it? What the government is doing is they're imposing what's called a carbon tax. It's a bit of a misnomer, as we'll talk about in a second, but here's how they justify it. Reducing carbon pollution. Well, as we'll see in a second, it's not pollution. Climate change has a cost, and putting a price on carbon is one way to help reduce pollution to help future generations. A price on carbon sends a clear signal, etc. So the government is using this language, but you have to look at how much of their language actually makes sense and how much of it is 1984 newspeak? Well, carbon dioxide, of course, is essential to plant photosynthesis. It's not a pollutant, not in any way a pollutant. Otherwise, when you gave mouth to mouth respiration, if you were a lifeguard like I was as a kid, you'd be poisoning your victim. And at less than 180 parts per million CO2, life is marginal. It got down to close to that during the last glacial period. Here's what happens when CO2 is increased above ambient levels. Right now, we're at about 420 parts per million, but you can see as we go up 600, 900, 1200, things get better and better for plants. And I'd like to show you a video. I don't think the audio is going to come out, so it's just music. It's a video from NASA. And NASA, believe it or not, are the ones that are telling us exactly this. So it's true, greenhouse gases have been high recently, 50% increase since 1880. And as a result, we're seeing very positive changes in the environment. And NASA finally admits this in their video here. And I love the way they end the video. They say, scientists say that the forests of the Amazon are also becoming green, well, more green. And they say, your planet is changing. We're on it. Well, of course it's changing. The only constant about climate is change. There's change all the time. In fact, it's funny, when people call me a climate change denier, I say, I deny that I deny climate change. I'm a denial denier. And yeah, if it were for climate change, I'd still be under 2 kilometers of ice right here in Ottawa, because of course that's what the conditions were 25,000 years ago. So yeah, of course climate changes. Calling us climate change deniers is absurd. It's completely ridiculous. The government statement has mistakes like this. Not carbon pollution, not pollution. These are not climate friendly products. They don't make any difference to the climate. So what I'd like to do next is look at how we got started on this in the first place, because it doesn't make any sense. You see, the government of Paul Martin decided to call carbon dioxide a toxic substance and add it to what's called the Canadian Environmental Protection Act list of toxic substances. So this is the list of toxic substances controlled under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And if you scroll down, what you see is carbon dioxide has been added to the list of toxic substances. Now, Stephen Harper was in the opposition at the time when Prime Minister Martin was Prime Minister, and they added it, and he said, that's ridiculous. You're adding carbon dioxide to the list. Well, the funny thing is, here's what they said after carbon dioxide on the list. This substance is not classified as toxic, but remains managed under Schedule 1 in order to give the government power, okay, for controlling it under the Clean Air or Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Now, more recently, the Trudeau government has removed that entirely, and they now say this. They're not even telling us it's not toxic on the list of toxic substances. The addition of carbon dioxide to Schedule 1 of CEPA, that's the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, gives the government the power to put in place a variety of preventative or control actions to control CO2 under the same act. Now, you might say, who cares what they're calling it? Who cares what list it's on? But it really does matter because language is critical in war. Among postmodernists, and these are the people who drive the woke agenda, if you go back to see where it originally came from, getting one's terms publicly adopted is not merely an aspect of ideology, but the very essence of ideological warfare. Okay, so we have to stop using the language of our enemies, the people who want to shut down farms, essentially. We have to stop calling it carbon pollution. But the government's imposed a carbon tax on us anyways. It applies to more than 20 different fuel sources that make greenhouse gases, and it depends on how much actual greenhouse gas a particular substance produces when you burn it. Now, I'm going to look at some of the costs because when you start realizing how much we're being charged already and where it's going in 2030, oh wow, yeah, it just really blows your mind. I have a Dodge Grand Caravan, so I thought, how much am I paying per liter when I fill up my tank? Turns out I'm paying 17.6 cents per liter right now on carbon tax. And of course, our good old government charges a tax on their carbon tax, double tax. So I'm really paying a total of $15.11 every time I fill up my tank with, I was going to say carbon dioxide, but no, every time I fill up my tank with gasoline. Now, by 2030, that number is going to more than double. It's going to be $32.11 every time I fill up my gas tank with gasoline just in carbon tax. Now, that's small in comparison with what people are going to have to pay on diesel trucks. Okay, let's take a look at diesel. Here's a Peterbilt truck that they use for shipping cattle, for example. Right now, there's a carbon tax for a liter of diesel fuel of 21.39 cents. Okay, now that means these numbers are not wrong. They're unbelievable, but it currently costs them with HST $329 plus for just paying the carbon tax every time they fill up the tank. And by 2030, it'll be $700 every time they fill up the tank of one of these big trucks. Okay, so that obviously gets added to the cost of food and it's part of the shipping costs, et cetera. So I mean, it's massive expensive. Let's look at propane. Okay, a standard 20-pound barbecue propane tank is going to see $2.49 with HST. By 2030, it'll be $5.29. Okay, now what about natural gas? Most people in Canada use natural gas to heat their homes, and at $80 per ton, which is the current level, it's going up to more than double that by 2030. That'll add 15.3 cents per cubic meter for natural gas. And what does that translate into? Well, $394 a year on average that a Canadian family is paying in tax, carbon tax, to heat their homes. And by 2030, it'll be over $800 every year that they pay in carbon tax just to heat their home. I mean, it's really amazing. Now, what about grain dryers? Now, they're trying to get an exemption for on-farm grain dryers. You know, it's Bill C-206. It's currently before the Senate. I was reading last night. They don't have any forecast as to when it's going to pass. But regardless, natural gas grain dryers and propane, by 2030, Ontario Grain Farmer magazine estimates it'll cost $46 per acre for the carbon tax to dry grain off farm. Now, we're hoping you won't have to pay anything on farm for the carbon tax. The total impact of the carbon tax, both indirect and direct, is estimated by the grain farmers of Ontario to reach $122 to $160 per acre. So imagine a 1,000-acre farm, you're talking about $160,000. I mean, it is truly incredible. Now, one of the drivers for this is that it's making the government a fortune. Okay, in budget 2024, Finance Canada said that the pollution pricing framework will rise from between 10.4 to 20.7 billion dollars, and that would place total proceeds over the decade at over 80 billion dollars. So you can be sure they're not going to drop it easily, that's for sure. And what's driving all this? Well, like our past speaker said, the idea supposedly is that global warming can only be stopped if we reduce CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion and industrial processes, and of course, agriculture. They also go ahead to say, oops, what? Too many slides. It's human-induced enhancement of the greenhouse effect that is of concern because ongoing emissions of greenhouse gases have the potential to warm the planet to levels that have never been experienced in the history of civilization. Excuse me. Well, of course, that's ridiculous, and we'll show you that in a minute. The fact that it's ridiculous doesn't seem to bother the media, though. They'll just blow it out of proportion as usual. So I'm going to show you a GIF, a moving graph, that actually shows you what happened during geologic time. We can go back about a 500 million years because we're using fossilized seashells to actually analyze temperature. Okay, so I'll mute myself and you can just watch this while I cough again. It's a pain having this bug, but at least I can do the presentation remotely. So here we go. Watch the correlation between CO2 and temperature, which according to environmentalists is very close. Okay, just watch this. This is throughout time. Look at the 440 million year mark. At that point, we were the coldest in the last 500 million years. And CO2 was 10 times higher than today. And it was this graph that really started me thinking something's wrong here. You know, it doesn't actually match empirical data from the past. So let's take a look and see what really goes on as we move through geologic time. Scientists note that geologically speaking, the Earth is in a CO2 famine. Geologic records reveal ice ages and ice houses have occurred when CO2 was at 2,000. Remember, we're at 420, okay, parts per million. Temperatures have been similar to the present day on Earth when carbon dioxide was up to 20 times higher than today. You know, we go to the more recent past and we see that, in fact, it was warmer in something called the hypsithermal period. Okay, it was the Holocene optimum. It was the warmest since the end of the last glacial. It was about 5,000 years ago. And what we see is that CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide were actually quite low, okay, in comparison with today. And yet it was warmer than today. So that also starts to make you wonder, is CO2 in these things really driving temperature? Well, as your previous speaker showed you, no. And I'll show you the graphs that actually illustrate what he was talking about. Now, we have good evidence that this is not an exaggeration. If we go back about 5,000 years, we look at fossilized tree stumps, okay? Here's a radioactive, radiocarbon dated tree stump from about 5,000 years ago, and it's currently 100 kilometers north of the tree line. So we know that about 5,000 years ago, at least in this part of the Earth, it was definitely warmer than today. Okay, so the idea that it's the warmest in history, things like that, doesn't make any sense. And this also shows it interesting. I believe your previous speaker spoke about this. We can actually see that the warming started long before human emissions of carbon dioxide started to take off. So it's like what Mark Twain said, it ain't what you know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Because most of what you hear in the climate scare, whether it's ocean acidification, polar bears, extreme weather, your previous speaker spoke about extreme weather, sea level, temperatures, all this sort of thing, storms, everything they're saying is either totally wrong or completely backwards. Okay, it's in a colder world when extreme weather, for example, is worse. Now we're constantly shown this graph here, which looks a little scary. It looks like temperatures are actually increasing at an alarming rate. But one of our advisors, actually Patrick Moore, who's on our board of directors, he took that data and he plotted it on this sort of a graph. He said you have to pay attention to what the ordinate axis is, okay? If you plot it on a temperature scale of 0 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, this is what it looks like. This is your existential threat. Now, of course, that's because carbon dioxide is a tiny part of the atmosphere, and we simply are responsible for very little of it. Here we can see the overall atmosphere, most of it being nitrogen and oxygen. You can see that CO2 is the lower 4 dots, okay, in the lower right. I'm going to zoom in on that. There we go. Man-made CO2 accumulated over 200 years. And we're supposed to believe that that little red dot is driving the whole system. Okay, so I mean, philosophically, it doesn't seem to even make any sense. Scientifically, it doesn't make any sense either, and we'll show you that in a second. Now, I'm going to actually get into a little bit of complex theory. I'll let you have take in this graph while I'm using a Kleenex, and then I'll explain it because it's very important and it's one that we're going to come back to a number of times during the presentation. What we have here is the amount of energy released at the top of the atmosphere back into space. That's the vertical axis, okay? And that's why they have watts per square meter, etc. That is the vertical axis, amount of energy being released to space. Now, the smooth curve, the one here with that's purple, this is what the atmosphere would be doing at all the different wavelengths, which are along the horizontal axis, if there was no greenhouse gases at all. But because there are greenhouse gases, it tends to reduce the amount of energy going to space. So at current levels of CO2, that's 400, roughly 400 parts per million, the amount of energy that's being trapped is the energy between the purple curve and the black curve, okay? When we double it, we get the red curve. Okay, so you can see there's almost no change. When you go from 0 CO2 to 400, there's a big change. Okay, but at 400, we're nearly saturated. And so doubling CO2 has almost no effect. Okay, so that's really important to understand. It's very much like painting a barn red. When you put on one coat of paint, it changes the barn's color quite a lot. When you put on a second coat, it changes a little bit. But when you put on any further coats, it doesn't really change the color of the barn because from a color perspective, the barn has become saturated. And you put on more coats to get better weathering, but it really won't change the color of the barn because it's saturated from a redness point of view. And that's what's happened with carbon dioxide. At 420 parts per million, you can double CO2 as we do here, and there's very, very little change, the outgoing radiation to space, and so consequently little change in temperature. And I'll show you what those temperature changes will be once we've handled all of the three greenhouse gases that we're going to deal with. But the computer models, they forecast this. The spaghetti, that's all the different computer models, they forecast much greater than the actual observations, which are in green. And the reason for this is simple. The models assume that CO2 is the primary driver. So in other words, the models are programmed to give you temperature changes that would occur if CO2 was the driver, but it's not. So not surprisingly, the temperatures they forecast are wrong. And yet this is the foundation of the climate scare. The fact that it's warmed 1.2 degrees since 1880 in no way is an emergency. In fact, you wouldn't even feel that in your lifetime. So the climate scare is based mostly on computer models. The fact is, though, if we go back 30 years, plug in the data and run the models, it doesn't give today's conditions. Typically, it'll give 3 times much more warming than has actually occurred. So the whole climate scare is based on computer models that don't work. We have lots of evidence that that's the case, actually. For example, you can see that glacier shortening started long before CO2 started to rise. I was just given some cough drops. That's probably a good idea. Somebody could hear me coughing in the background. But regardless, you can see coal, oil, and natural gas use started long after glaciers started to shorten. And as a consequence, here's what we see. Global deaths from natural disasters. They're way, way down. Now, there's various reasons for that. It's not just that extreme weather is down, which it is, by the way. People ask me, they say, oh, what about all this extreme weather we hear the best database in the world for extreme weather is something put out by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States. They have statewide extreme weather records, things like highest temperature, most wind, most rain, biggest hailstone. Colorado had a hailstone a half a foot in diameter, if you can imagine that. And in 1936, they had 27 extreme weather records set on a statewide basis. That was during the Dust Bowl years. And those records still stand today. Okay, 1936, 27 records. So I always ask people, and I give them a prize, like one of these books to hand out, for example, which we've just published and John has copies of. You can get these on our homepage at icsc Canada.com. This is called, we call it the Green Book, okay? And it's a summary of the climate issue from a Canadian perspective. It turns out in 2024, the total number of records set on an extreme weather record set on a statewide basis for the U.S. is zero. Zero. So that's one of the reasons that extreme weather deaths from natural disasters is way down. Okay, now they also produce this interesting graph, which I'll let you study for a second while I use a Kleenex. What it shows is virtually every category of global deaths from disasters. The peak was in the past. Now, it's partly because we have better remote sensing. We have better ideas as to what's coming in the future. We also have, more strong infrastructure. We're better adapting to climate change. But you have to realize that the cost for repairs after a major hurricane, for example, will still go up because there's more things to knock down. And I'll just zoom in here. Look at this droughts. Okay. The droughts were like 1928, Chinese drought, 1943, 1965. There's almost nothing happening now with respect to massive deaths due to natural disasters. There's almost nothing happening. When we do hear about high figures of insurance claims and things, that's because there's more stuff to knock down. For example, if you actually look at the infrastructure across the world, there's been roughly a 13-fold increase in infrastructure where you'd have one hotel on a stretch of Florida Beach 100 years ago, you now have 13. Now, the buildings are built better, no question about it. We have better distant warning, but on average, you're going to get more expensive disasters because there's just more stuff to knock down. I'll zoom down a little bit more to another one. Look at this. Storms. Yeah, there was a big storm in 2008. Myanmar, a lot of people killed. But generally speaking, what we're finding is that the consensus is wrong. We're hearing constantly, the consensus of scientists agree. Well, as Walter Lippmann said, he said, when all men think alike, no one thinks very much. And there isn't really a consensus anyways. There's a manufactured consensus, one where you interview scientists who know that you're going to agree with them, and they can get consensus that way. So CO2 is really not a problem. In fact, CO2 is beneficial for many reasons. So let's take a look at the next one, nitrous oxide. The Canadian government has a countrywide target to reduce absolute emissions or absolute levels of greenhouse gas emissions arising from fertilizer application by 30% by 2030, 30% below 2020 levels. Now, we look at the amount of fertilizer being used. It's more. There's no question about it. It's not because of inefficiency, though. It's because of an increase in area under crop productivity, the area under fertilization and intensive crops, and an increase in soil degradation, which is unfortunate, but that's not caused by climate change. So let's have a look at what the World Economic Forum tells us is possible. Okay, they say fertilizer emissions could be cut to 1/5 of today's current levels without threatening the food supply. It's ridiculous. However, a co-author on the research tells Carbon Brief that this figure would be very challenging to achieve, both economically and in terms of practical implementation. Well, that's an understatement to say the least. I've asked people, is it realistic to expect to have massive reductions in emissions of fertilizer without having massive reductions in fertilizer? And pretty well everyone says, no, you're going to have big reductions in fertilizer. So what would be the cost of big reductions in fertilizer? I have you some numbers here, which will kind of blow you away. Fertilizer Canada said how reducing nitrogen-based fertilizer use by 20% would affect food production and farm incomes. In 2030, the total value of lost canola, corn, and spring wheat production would be $10.4 billion, okay, in 1 year. Cumulative losses over the period 2023 to 2030 would be 40.5 billion. Okay, so there is no question that it would be very, very expensive. Assuming that all of the remaining supply were sold within Canada, by 2030, Canadian exports of canola would decline from more than 10 million tons today to only 750,000 tons. Okay, massive, massive reduction. And I'll just point out, if you go to our website, icsc-canada.com, Robert Lyman has done a very good report. He's our economics and policy advisor. He worked in the government for many, many years in the environment field. And he wrote a report called Less Food on Your Fork. Okay. Now, and that's very worth reading, okay, because you get a good feeling for how much it's going to cost. But we're told that the restriction of the restriction of nitrous oxide emissions is going to be voluntary. Oh yeah. Well, let's take a look at an inside piece of information received as access to information. It says officials consider the use of mandatory regulations as a policy option if the voluntary approach fails to meet its objectives. Okay, so it's only a matter of time before it's going to become mandatory, that's for sure. Now, we have to realize this is pretty unfair to Canadian farmers because per unit of cropland, Canada's nitrogen oxide emissions from fertilizer, we're very efficient. It's half that of the United States. Ontario farmers have a very high nitrogen use efficiency, often exceeding 60%, while the global average is 40 to 50. So we're already very efficient in our use of fertilizers. And of course, that's because it's expensive. You don't need to push farmers to be better in their, at least not in Ontario, to be better in their nitrogen fertilizer use because it's expensive. The 2020 baseline does not recognize the progress made from large investments made in soil health and fertilizer efficiency when increasing crop production by 70%. Okay, massive increase in crop production. Now, the next graph I'm going to show you has to do with nitrous oxide. It's the same as the previous one. I'll just go back to show you the big overview. Remember, the purple is what the atmosphere would do with no greenhouse gases. The black is what it would do at current levels of nitrous oxide. And the red is if we double nitrous oxide. And once again, you can see it's very, very tiny. The change in the radiation to space, and therefore the change or the warming that would occur, is almost imperceptible if you double methane. Okay, now doubling methane is going to take a lot, not methane, but nitrous oxide. We'll get to methane in a second, but it's very similar. I think Fabiano did these numbers before, but they're pretty tiny to say the least, okay? But it's interesting because government and their climate allies, they get us all very excited. They say that for current concentrations of greenhouse gases, the radiative force per added N2O molecule is about 230 times that for carbon dioxide. Oh my God, sounds bad, eh? This is my daughter's tea. That'll hopefully stop me from coughing so much. But they don't tell you a very key factor, and that is that the rate of increase of CO2 molecules is about 3,000 times larger than the rate of increase of N2O. So the fact that N2O is a more powerful greenhouse gas really doesn't matter because there's almost none of it to begin with. It's measured in parts per billion. But secondly, it's increasing at 1/3000th the rate of carbon dioxide, which we already showed has almost no impact on climate. So you do the multiplication and you find out that the contribution of nitrous oxide to the annual increase in the forcing, in other words, the amount that it's warming the atmosphere, is only about 1/13th of CO2. And we already decided that CO2 was very small in its impact anyway, at this level of concentration, of course. So here's what Bob Lyman says, and this is really important, I think, for farmers. It's a new part of the presentation, quite different to what Fabiano talked about, I believe. But regardless, let's look at what he said. The organizations representing farmers in Canada have judged that it is pointless to challenge the merits of the emissions reduction targets, and they're seeking to accommodate the government's agenda in the hopes of moderating it or reducing its costs. I would argue that this is a fundamental flaw. In my view, farmers' organizations have failed adequately to consider the context of the Trudeau government's demonstrated approach to climate policy. The approach is one based on a single-minded adherence to the absolutist goal of reducing and eliminating hydrocarbon-based energy uses regardless of cost. The target of reducing fertilizer-caused emissions by 30% is merely an interim one. The ultimate goal endlessly repeated, is to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions and therefore to eliminate hydrocarbon-based fertilizers no later than 2050. Well, I have to say, well, what on earth would happen if that really did happen? Well, I'll let you read this, give my voice a break, and you'll see what happens when you actually really do what the government's wanting to do. The Sri Lankan government, they were the poster child of the World Economic Forum. This is how I will make my country rich by 2025. So he basically banned the use of all nitrogen fertilizers. And the result was a halving of the production of rice and an 80% increase in the price of rice. And the public went wild. They protested. They invaded the presidential palace. There's pictures of them jumping in the presidential pool. They just went crazy. And of course, the president had to flee the country for his life. And this is what they want to do on a worldwide basis, okay? So as I say, demonstrators run from tear gas used by police during a protest demanding the resignation of the Sri Lankan president. Well, he left the country. So yeah, I guess he resigned amid the country's 2022 economic crisis brought on by no organic fertilizers policy. This is part of the report by Bob Lyman. So he goes on to say this: accommodation, in other words, farmers' groups accommodating the government, even if successful, will only buy time. And even then, not much of it. Any farmer contemplating the idea of spending millions of dollars to meet the 2030 target would be foolish to not consider what happens next. Because, of course, that's just the beginning. We'll talk about how to fight back in a second. I'm just going to touch on methane before we get onto that, because methane shows a very similar curve. Okay, once again, the black is methane at its current level, and red, and I'll zoom in here. You can see the red. This is from Happer et al., which I understand Fabiano talked about it in detail. But this shows the actual graphs that are in their report. And by the way, I should mention that if you go to our homepage, icsc-canada.com, you can see the fifth box down is a link to one of their papers, which shows and gives more explanation of what's going on here. But the thing to notice is, like the other curves, like for nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, the difference between today's level of, in this case, methane, the black line, and doubling methane is almost imperceptible, because the bottom line is that all three gases are already saturated, almost totally, not completely. There's a small additional change. And we'll show you what the additional change would be in a second. Here's the conclusion for methane. I'll just let you read that. And here's the graph from their paper that gives the overall picture, okay? Now, there's a number here I want to point out that's really important, 137 watts per square meter. Okay, that's the total amount, basically, that the atmosphere is holding in as heat, okay, by things like the greenhouse effect and other factors. Most of that is actually water vapor. Most of the global warming is, in fact, water vapor. Now, that number is important because I want you to have a look at that number, 137, and compare it with the forcing in watts per square meter that's having happened, or is happening, or projected to happen, as a result of nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide. Look at these numbers. They're tiny. 1.5, 2, 2.5, and that's over 50 years in the case of carbon dioxide, almost 2.5 watts per square meter, yielding a temperature change in that case of about 0.4 degrees over 50 years. Okay, and that's if CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide continue at their current level. So this is just blowing it up a little bit. The total of those three gases is the black line, and then each gas gives this contribution, this increasing contribution, slightly increasing, to the warming of the atmosphere that you can see in each of these cases, okay? And it's very, very tiny. Remember, we're talking about over 300 in total for the atmosphere, and we're talking about 1.5, 2. Very, very small. So after 50 years, with a continuation of the increase of today's CO2 rates, methane rates, and nitrous oxide rates, these are the forecasts you get up to 50 years in the future. It's very, very small. Okay, certainly not an existential threat, that's for sure. So the question is, are net zero targets of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide misguided? Well, I think Fabiano and myself would definitely say yes, they're completely misguided. Okay, it's completely wrong. There's no question about it. So the question then becomes, so how do we get out of this? Well, first thing we have to do is to stop accommodating the government's agenda in the hopes of moderating it or reducing its cost. I mean, you just have to stop that. And the different farming associations simply think they can kind of finesse it, but you can't, okay? Because the ultimate outcome of their policy will destroy farming in Canada, no question about it. And half the world currently is fed with inorganic fertilizers. People often say to me, what's the most important invention of the 20th century? Well, it's obviously the Haber-Bosch process to produce ammonia by reforming natural gas. I mean, that is feeding half the world. So getting rid of inorganic fertilizers is a complete and total disaster. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should do what they did in the Netherlands, where they blockaded streets and went crazy. I agree with them, of course. No farmer, no food, no future. You can't be more direct than that. But there are things that you can do, and I'm going to outline them right now, okay? Because there are some very sensible things you can do without having to go onto the streets and cause civic unrest. Well, the first thing you have to recognize is that we're not going to be saved by this by a new government. Okay? You do not rely on the likelihood of a new Conservative Party of Canada government to end this disaster. And I'll show you exactly why that is the case. You see, Axe the Tax only addresses one of the symptoms of the climate disease that's infecting Canada. There's all kinds of other symptoms, okay? And so yeah, you can get rid of the Axe, the tax. That's a good thing to get rid of. But if you bring in policies that are equally bad, like Aaron O'Toole did, he had policies which, if they were implemented, people like economist Ross McKittrick said that his policies could even be more expensive than the tax policy. So it's not good enough to just get rid of one symptom of the disease. You got to get rid of the disease. I don't think they're going to do it unless they're pushed really hard. And I'll explain how to push them, and I'll explain now why I don't think a conservative government is going to do much to help us. We should go back to a time in the past when the conservatives were the government. Okay, in fact, we'll even go a little before that. We'll go back to a time when Stephen Harper wanted to become prime minister. And what did he say? Well, here's what he said in a letter to the Canadian Alliance, because, of course, it was the predecessor to the Canadian Conservative Party of Canada. He said, we're gearing up now for the biggest struggle our party has faced since you entrusted me with the leadership. I'm talking about the Battle of Kyoto, our campaign to block job-killing, economy-destroying Kyoto Protocol. And he wrote that it's based on a tentative and contradictory scientific evidence. Can't be much more straightforward and honest than that. And it focuses on carbon dioxide, which is essential to life. Now, this is what Harper said before he was prime minister. Kyoto is essentially a socialist scheme to suck money out of the wealth-producing nations, which is exactly true. A money-sucking socialist scheme is a pretty candid statement, but of course, it's true. Now, he did a similar thing in Barrie a couple of years ago. A couple of years later, he didn't get elected, of course, for 2 more years. He said, the science is still evolving. Okay. Now, remember, the common theme among advisors to the Conservative Party is you can't contest the science or you'll never win government. Well, of course, we just saw that's not true. Trump having won 2 of the past 3 presidential elections. And he goes even farther, of course. At times he calls it a hoax to help the Chinese and stuff like that. But regardless, Harper, before he became prime minister, said the science is still evolving and there may be better ways to clean the air. He wants Canada to focus on smog-causing industrial pollutants, etc. Okay, so his approach was very sensible. This was before he became prime minister, and he did win. Okay, now remember, Aaron O'Toole, Andrew Scheer, they had climate change policies, which could have been more expensive than a carbon tax, and they both lost. They both lost the election. Harper was a climate realist. He said what was true, okay? And he won the election. Now, what happened when he came into power? That's a totally different question. He was his Canada was one of the first countries to sign the Copenhagen Accord. Okay, I went to Copenhagen in 2009. It was kind of funny. They didn't expect to have 30,000 people show up, and they did. And the Al Gore effect was in full blast statistically, and it's only a statistic. It's not cause and effect. It turns out it's typically colder when Al Gore goes to a conference than when he's not there. So the Al Gore effect hit. It was the coldest it had been in Copenhagen in many decades, and they didn't plan for 30,000 delegates, even though that number registered. So people were standing in line in the cold. Africans standing in line for 8, 9, 10 hours. A lot of them didn't get in. So I'm sure a lot of the protesters on the street afterwards were actually delegates that couldn't get into the darn conference. Now, Canada committed to a 17% reduction in greenhouse gases by this target. Okay. Remember, this is a guy who, in the lead up to the election, was a climate realist. He went further and he said, it said the accord was not seen as legally binding, but then Environment Minister Jim Prentice said that the government would work hard to make it legally binding. Well, thank you, Mr. Prentice. We didn't elect you folks for that, but they changed. Okay, the deep state, the forces of the media, etc., changed them after they became in power. And in fact, let's look at the throne speech. The Copenhagen Accord is fully supported by the government of Canada. Here at home, our government will continue to take steps to fight climate change. And this is in their budget, okay? I won't bother going through it all, but there's like tons of mistakes in it. You can read this on the PowerPoint or the YouTube slide later. It just shows that they took it very, very seriously, and they were putting in all kinds of things that are just not true. We're really just like the Liberals. And in fact, you'd laugh when Justin Trudeau took over after Harper, he didn't even change the target that the Conservatives had because Harper's target was so good, it was good enough for Trudeau. It was only later that he eventually changed it. In fact, he was being criticized pretty harshly by the environmentalists because they said, well, your target is no different to Harper's target. Well, that's because Harper had become a climate activist essentially. And the federal budget, I mean, they actually used tricks. For example, they changed climate change and air quality to just clean air, okay, which is 1984 newspeak, okay? And so consequently, all these numbers, all of this in the federal budget is wrong. So even though Harper campaigned as a climate realist, he became a climate activist after becoming elected PM. And there's lots of other examples. I can go through them all, but just let me get the slides here. His government endorsed and promoted the outcome of the 2010 Cancun UN agreement, and that was the beginning of this massive $100 billion a year green fund, okay, that we're supposed to give to developing countries. And of course, that was tripled to be starting next year to $300 billion a year that we're supposed to pay for our supposed sins to the developing world. Well, Harper agreed to that, okay? And here's the kicker. This is nuts. His government left carbon dioxide in CEPA's list of toxic substances, even though he had railed about it being insane. So then you have to ask yourself, okay, Harper was a climate realist, then he changed sides. What about Pierre Poilievre? Well, Pierre Poilievre already supports the climate scare. Okay, let's look at what he supports. He supports carbon capture and storage, electric vehicles, replacing coal with natural gas, especially with developing countries. He's already a climate activist before becoming prime minister. So the idea that he's going to be any less bad than Harper was, well, good luck with that. So the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada, they must be pushed. And I mean pushed hard. And I'll talk about how we can do that in a second. I should just point out that a lot of people, once you get a conservative government, will say, well, we shouldn't criticize them because they're our guys. They're in power. They're not as bad as if Trudeau had continued. Well, of course, that's debatable, at least on the climate issue. But it's interesting. I was told by people in Prime Minister Harper's office that they actually liked it when we criticized them in the media from the right. In other words, from the climate realist side. And I said, because I was a little worried, like, am I pissing them off? I'm really alienating them. Are they going to be my enemy for life because I'm saying, hey, what are you doing supporting the climate scare? And they told me, they said, no, we like it when you criticize us from the right because it makes us seem more moderate. So smart politicians and smart, not all of them are smart, but they would welcome us to push hard because it'll allow them to drift more to the center and eventually have more sensible policies. So we need to push them hard, first of all, to stop supporting the climate scare. Okay, I'm not saying at first they should oppose it, but there are things they can do. Stop using the language of the left, okay? No question about that. Now, here's what they really should be saying. Pierre Poilievre, right now he could say it, but certainly after becoming prime minister, he could say this. Look, I'm not a climate expert. I don't pretend to understand the science, but I do know that there are many scientists at Carleton University, Ottawa University, Guelph University, all across Canada, who do not think that we face a climate crisis. And there has been no public debate held in Canada for the public to actually hear from both sides. So I think, as new prime minister, that it would be irresponsible for me to go ahead with multi-billion-dollar plans without opening up the full story to Canadians to let them decide, what do they think? Do they think this is a serious climate crisis that we need to address? So what we should do is we should actually push them to hold cross-Canada public hearings into the science of climate change. And I could arrange quite a few of the scientists to go myself because I know who they are and I work with them. Nancy Green-Rain did exactly this in the Senate. Okay, she brought in Tim Patterson, who's now chair of Earth Sciences at Carleton University. She brought in Ian Clark, professor of Earth Sciences at Ottawa U, and Ross McKittrick, who was the one who said that O'Toole's plan could very well be more expensive than a carbon tax, from Guelph University, and Jan Weiser, who is also a prof, very esteemed prof from Ottawa U. And they were all brought into the Senate, and they gave a really wonderful overview of the science. And they showed that the science is anything but settled. So that it has been done to a certain extent, but it needs to be done on a regular basis across Canada. Now, of course, you'll say, well, how would the public know who to believe if you bring in scientists on both sides of the debate? Well, the answer to that is they wouldn't. And so they'd be very confused. And that would be totally appropriate. Okay, boy, I should have drunk this tea at the beginning of my presentation. My coughing's gone away. Anyway, the public would be very confused. They'd say, well, Professor Weaver says this from UVic, in support of the climate scare. Professor Clark says this against it. I mean, who do I believe? Who do I believe? Well, of course, the answer is the topic is so complicated that it's quite acceptable, quite appropriate for the average person to say, I don't know. And if they don't know, they're not going to have a lot of patience with massive expenditures to be spent on climate change. They're not going to have, patience with soaring food prices because of a carbon tax causing transportation to cost so much. They're just not going to have patience. So, of course, the environmentalists are doing everything they can to suppress debate. And the reason is they don't want to take the lid off the Pandora's box that is climate change. I mean, climate change is probably the most complex science we have ever tackled. It's more complicated than building the atomic bomb, okay? It is unbelievably complicated. It's so complicated that many scientists say, Chris Essex, for example, from the University of Western Ontario, that we will never be able to forecast climate because it's a coupled, nonlinear, very unstable system. Okay, in which there's so many feedbacks. And I think Fabiano showed you there's many, many causes of climate change. And to try and integrate them all into a computer model that will generate future climate, it may not even be possible, let alone, done at this point. So the environmentalists want to keep the lid on that box. They don't want people to hear what's in this book, okay? And I really encourage people, get a copy of it. It's very easy to read, lots of pictures and, very quick factoids and things like that. It's called Energy and Climate at a Glance, Canadian edition. For $22, we'll ship it to you as soon as the strike is over, unless you want us to courier, in which case, let us know. If you go to our website, icsc-canada.com, you can order a copy of the book. $22 will get it shipped to you with tax and everything included. But this is what we have to do. We have to open the debate. We actually have to expose the public. Now, one of the ways that we have to demand this is to actually go to public hearings, go to open town halls, and actually speak out in an organized way. And I encourage people to go to this website. It's sensiblechange.ca. It's a new group that I work on contract with. And what I'm doing is I'm helping train what are called pathfinders. If you go to the lower right here, you see it says become a pathfinder. It doesn't cost anything. You just click on it and you'll become a pathfinder. A pathfinder is somebody who's given inside information in this website. There are people who I will be training. Now, here in Ottawa, I organized quite a number of average citizens to speak out during the mayoral debates. They had public debates and people could go to the microphone. And it was quite amazing because a group called Action for Canada, for example, was involved with us. And these were very brave people. I trained them in the science, so they actually knew what they were talking about and the economics and the policy. And then they went to the microphone and they really made it clear that the leading candidate for mayor, who is Catherine McKenney, who was at that time a councillor, she was assumed that she was going to win. Okay, and she was a strong climate activist. She wanted to spend $250 million on bicycle paths, if you can believe that, at a time when we were turning people away from rehab centers because we didn't have enough money. So essentially, we showed that her policies made no sense, and those of other candidates made no sense either when they were trying to stop climate change. It didn't make any sense at all. And it's interesting because that was a major contributor, we believe, and advisors of, political people have told us as well, that it had a big impact on many people who were going to support a third and fourth candidate actually moving over to the second place candidate, who was Mark Sutcliffe. And he won. He ended up getting, literally in the last minute, suddenly skyrocketing vote. He ended up with 51% of the vote, which is pretty amazing when you consider that there was something like 12 people in the election. And if the CPC won't hold hearings into the science, and there's a good chance they won't, and I'll tell you why in a second, but if they won't hold hearings into the science, then the Farmers Association should do it themselves. There's no reason why the Farmers Association shouldn't say, hey, this is a massively expensive endeavor. The whole climate issue is something that's going to affect all of our customers. It's affecting us hugely. We want to hear what the public have not heard to this point. In other words, we want to hear a debate. We want to hear from scientists on all sides of the issue, and we're going to publicize it so the public know what's really going on. So if the Farmers Association, CFFO, for example, were to sponsor debates with scientists, bringing in people from both sides, not being angry or aggressive towards any of them, just, okay, what's your opinion, and letting them speak, issuing strategic press releases, getting involved in extensive media promotion, and holding the events in large public venues across Canada, I think this would help take the lid off the Pandora's box that is climate change, that is, in fact, crippling our society. And I really encourage the Farmers Associations to do this. I'd be very happy to work with you. I used to work in a communications firm downtown and actually can put out press releases and do all the strategic communications. So, I mean, that's something I'd be very happy to work with the Farmers Associations on. In ICSC Canada, we actually have members like Patrick Moore, for example, who I'm sure would be very pleased to testify. So fighting back is not easy. I mean, it also involves things like calling into radio talk shows. You'd be surprised how effective that can be. For example, if you send a letter to an MP and do nothing else, good chance you'll not hear anything at all. However, if you call into a radio talk show and say, I've written a letter into my MP, so-and-so, and here's what I've said, I'm going to call in later in a week or two or three or four and tell you what the response was. You record that. You then send it to the MP and you say, yeah, no matter, whatever you say, I'll be happy to repeat it on air. So suddenly there's publicity attached to your letter to the MP. So there's all kinds of things you can do, and we did those things, many of them here in Ottawa, and it worked very effectively. So I do encourage people, go to sensiblechange.ca and become a pathfinder. And there's no commitment to do anything. If you want to be involved in doing things, that's great. We have a more advanced stage called a trailblazer, people who actually give presentations. But if you register to be a Pathfinder, you can be kept up to date and you can attend the training sessions. I'll be doing one next week about how to be effective in public events, okay? So my recommendation is we must speak out. And the first step would be to become a Pathfinder and also put your email address here on the icsc-canada.com website. Just put it in. You can see in the upper right here, there's a little window. You don't have to even tell me your name, and you'll be kept up to date on all of our activities. So our main difference between us and other climate realist groups is we don't just study the science. We actually work to change society. And that's why we're here to help you. So thanks for your time. I'll take questions.
Yeah, just come right up close.
Yeah, so the question is, why has there been so little uptake, or why has it been so slow for there to be any uptake on this information that you presented today? Like, why aren't the newspapers, the farm organizations, been clamoring over one and another, to bring this issue before us?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons. Money is a big part of it. I asked one of the lead editors at a local Canadian newspaper, I won't even say which newspaper, but because he told me this in confidence, I asked him, when I started writing with Tim Patterson around 1999 on this topic, I actually taught his course at Carleton University. They used to publish us literally from coast to coast, from the Halifax Herald, Ottawa Citizen, Winnipeg Free Press, all the way over to Vancouver Sun. But they dried up around 2010, something like that. So I asked this leading editor, I say, why don't you show both sides of the debate in your comments section, in your editorial part, the way you used to? Why don't you do it? And at first he said, oh, we agree with David Suzuki. I said, yeah, but you realize that David Suzuki was a fruit fly geneticist when he was a scientist, and he's not really an expert in this field. I said, but do you have anybody on staff who has even a Bachelor of Science who could judge between the different points of view? And he said, no. I said, well then, okay, why do you really do it? What is the reason you only show us the alarmist side? And he admitted the truth to me. He said, if we allowed people like Ian Clark and Ross McKittrick and Tim Patterson and Madhav Kandekar and Patrick Moore and all the different scientists across Canada who don't agree with the climate scare, if we let them speak out on our editorial pages, our advertisers wouldn't like it. Now, there's two reasons for that. One is that catastrophe sells, okay? Bad news sells. The end of the world, whoa, that sells media. And of course, the higher circulation is something the advertisers want. The other thing is that many advertisers, car companies, printing companies, are using the climate scare to sell their products. So if they say, oh, buy our car, it's going to reduce greenhouse gases. And then you have Ian Clark on the next page saying, makes no difference. It's a natural phenomena. Climate always changes. The amount we're contributing is trivial. It would make the advertiser's ad look pretty stupid. So they don't publish us partly for that reason. But there's lots of other drivers. It has huge amount of money behind it. There's over $1 billion US a day being spent around the world on climate finance. And, and most of it's going to alternative energy, wind and solar power in particular. So they are making an absolute fortune, and they can buy ads in all the newspapers, and, they can have very expensive press releases. Just to show you what you can do with money, when I went to Copenhagen in 2009, we actually had a fairly large donor supporting us. And it allowed us to buy a press release that we translated into 18 languages and sent all over the world. And it had huge impact, okay? It really did. But it cost $7,000 for a single page press release. So if you have the funds, you can flood the world with your information, and those groups have the funds, huge amounts of money. When Climate Works Foundation was started up, that's the group that funds Al Gore and all sorts of other groups, their startup funding, okay, normally a group starts up with maybe $1,000 in the bank and 5 volunteers. Their startup funding was over $500 million, okay? So they have huge amounts of money. That's it. So money is what is driving it more than anything. The other thing that's driving it, of course, is general ignorance. People don't understand that climate is a 30-year average of weather. So you could point to any meteorological events anywhere in the world for years, and it still wouldn't be climate change. It would just be meteorological events. So people don't have a fundamental understanding. And of course, that is one of the main reasons why we published this book, because if you have a fundamental understanding of it, you realize the whole thing is ludicrous. I mean, a 1.2-degree rise since 1880 is, you wouldn't even feel it in your lifetime. So it's ignorance. There are other goals. One of them is that if you bring the world under a controlled CO2 reduction umbrella, you're essentially controlling the energy of the world, since 80% of the world's energy is fossil fuels. And if you control the world's energy, you control the world. So it's actually David Anderson, who was previous environment minister. I recall that he said that the Kyoto Protocol was the flagship of world governance. So many people believe that we would be benefit if there was a world government, and this is a major step towards it. You control the world. Sorry, you control the world's energy. You control the world. And believe it or not, there are some groups, and fortunately they're a minority, but they think that humans are a cancer on the planet. I mean, Suzuki has spoken like this, for example, in the past. There's a group called the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement. And again, they're an extreme group, but there are thousands of members who honestly believe that the world would be better off if we weren't here. So getting rid of the energy that keeps us alive is one way to do it. So there's lots of reasons why we haven't been successful. I'll just give you one more, and this is where ICSC Canada comes in. The left have been extremely effective in mobilizing people to speak out in support of their ideals, and they use something called Rules for Radicals, which was written by Saul Alinsky back in around 1970, 71. And what he showed is how people on the outside can actually win and become the controllers of society. And they followed his rules very well. Hillary Clinton did her graduating year thesis on Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And so what I do is I actually use the Rules for Radicals to help teach people on our side of the debate, conservatives generally speaking, although we do have some liberals on our side who properly understand the science, how we can use these Rules for Radicals to speak out and actually win back the control of our government so they stop doing this. So yeah, part of this is a massively successful activism campaign that we have to replicate, quite frankly, if we're going to win back our society.